buenas tardes a todos. Iniciamos este seminario que está organizado desde los Países Bajos. Me van a permitir simplemente una muy breve introducción antes de dar la palabra a Remy Bragg. Decir simplemente que estamos en plena ofensiva cultural y tenemos que ser conscientes que más que nunca tenemos que presentar una alternativa en el ámbito cultural, en el ámbito de las ideas. Y hoy celebramos este seminario con el privilegio de contar con Remy Bragg. Remy Bragg es un referente para todos nosotros y es evidente que tenemos que ser conscientes que tenemos que, en este debate que se está abriendo sobre el futuro de Europa, saber estar presentes, alzar nuestra voz, demostrar que hay millones de europeos que piensan de la misma manera en los principios fundamentales. Y ahí se inscribe el conjunto de seminarios que estamos desarrollando hoy desde los Países Bajos. Seamos conscientes del momento en el que vivimos, del momento difícil en el que vivimos y que tenemos que estar juntos, unidos y ser capaces de organizar un evento que lo haremos durante este final de año y principios del siguiente para poder definir una posición respecto de lo que son los fundamentos de nuestra Europa. Muchas gracias. A partir de este momento, Remy Bragg tiene la palabra. Remy.
Okay, at having to introduce a seminar which they broadcast from the Netherlands. There are two reasons for that. First, a personal one. I happen to be trying to learn some Dutch in order to be able to read in the original some important books written in this language. Among them are the works of Johannes Huizinga. Todd Huizinga's namesake. I don't know whether the latter has a family tie with a great historian, for this surname is hardly rare in the Netherlands. Be that as it may, the second reason is more important. Most unfortunately, the Netherlands have been for some time and still are the spearhead of alleged progress on so-called societal issues. It is especially exciting and encouraging for us French people to learn that there are irreducible goals there too. Let us listen to three of them.
And welcome again to this webinar on behalf of Leontien Bakkemars and myself, Elisa Garcia, from one of us, Netherlands. And let me briefly introduce the subject of today before I present you the speakers. And as we know, and as Jaime said, in our current postmodern liberal society, emphasis is put on the language of individual rights, freedom of choice, independence, privacy, informed consent, and self-determination, while little of no attention at all is given to the notions of community, common good, and public interest. Therefore, it is important that we reflect on the pitfalls of this individualistic view of the autonomy of the human person, which ignores the relevant role that our relationships with other persons play in the identity of each of us. And just because the human being is a person, he is a relational being who is called to contribute to society in a personal and unique way, as it is expressed in the traditional Christian values, which are at the basis of our European culture, and which we need to rediscover and to put back. And mainly because nowadays values of some ideologies like LBGTI are gaining ground since they are considered by many governments and by many people as the current European values. Having said this, I am pleased to introduce you the three speakers of today. And the first speaker is Todd Huizinga. He's a senior fellow for Europe of the Religious Freedom Institute and a member of the faculty of the Christian Open Academy in Ukraine. The second speaker of today is Hans van de Brevaart. He works at the Guido de Brest Foundation, and that is the research institute for the Dutch Reformed Political Party. And he's also a member in the think tank of the European Christian Political Movement. And then the third speaker of today is Daniel van Schalwijk. He's an expert in personal growth, inspired by an interdisciplinary perspective that integrates insights from science, philosophy, and Christian religion and spirituality. And before the first speaker begins, I wanted to say that if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and then after the three talks, they can answer your questions. And now, please, Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this seminar. It's truly an honor to be here. And Remy, I don't know whether I'm related to Johann Huizinga, but I won't say that I'm not. I might be related to him, but I don't know. Since we don't have much time, I will get right to the point. I have left out many nuances and details, but I hope I can cover the most important themes of my topic. The topic of my presentation is individualism and solidarity. How can we safeguard our hard-won individual rights while also living in community and solidarity with others? Here is the problem we face. In the postmodern West, we have discarded that which gave us a solid, intellectually coherent ground for balancing individualism with solidarity. Namely, we have discarded the Judeo-Christian view of the human person. Our postmodern societies in North America and Europe refuse to acknowledge that our identity is rooted not in ourselves, but in our Creator God. We are not autonomous beings deciding for ourselves what is true, what is good, and who we are. Rather, we are creatures who bear the image of God, made to glorify Him and to love Him above all and our neighbor as ourselves. So how would God have us live? Here I would like to quickly sketch the view of the great reformer Martin Luther, whose influence as a Christian thinker is not sufficiently recognized. He was a man whose thought is of profound value to all Christians, Protestant or Catholic, and to non-Christians as well. Let me give you a rough overview of what Luther has to say about individualism and solidarity, leaning on Luther's classic tract of 1520 on the freedom of a Christian, von der Freiheit eines Christenmenschen. Without using the terms individuality and solidarity, Luther argues that they are foundational for the Christian life in society, and he grounds both individualism and solidarity in the equality of human beings' status before God. He writes, and I quote, "There is no basic difference in status between laymen and priests, princes and bishops, religious and secular," close quote. We all share equally in what the theologian John Whitty Jr. calls a doubly paradoxical nature. First, each person, and remember, Luther is talking about Christians here. First, each person is at once a saint and a sinner, righteous and reprobate, saved and lost. Second, each person is at once a free lord who is subject to no one, and a dutiful servant who is subject to everyone. Because salvation and freedom from bondage to sin is available to all who believe, we are all saints. Regardless of social status, regardless of whether we are pope or pauper, we are free lords subject to no one. We are individuals, recognized and loved by God as individual men and women. At the same time, we are all called to imitate Christ and serve the people created in his image. Thus, we are all dutiful servants subject to everyone, called to live in solidarity with those around us. This is true individualism and true solidarity. We are all free lords subject to no one, yet also dutiful servants subject to everyone. And why? Let me say it again. Because of the equal status of all human beings before God. We are all unworthy sinners, yet we are all worthy of salvation through trust in God. Thus, regardless of our earthly status, we all possess equal and inviolable dignity as individuals, and we are all called to solidarity in service to others. Now, perhaps the most important point of all is that in this view, human individuality and solidarity are not grounded in human beings in and of themselves. Rather, they rest on the human connection to the one true God, to the ineffable fusion of individuality and solidarity within the one God who exists in the three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and in his solidarity with us, his justice, his mercy, his patience, and love for us as his creatures. Thus, individuality and solidarity are not contingent, as human existence is contingent. Rather, individuality and solidarity are necessary and unassailable components of a just society, just as God is the one and only necessary and unassailable being. It is of utmost importance here to openly state the obvious. None of it makes sense without the Christian faith. None of what I've said makes sense without the Christian faith. I do not apologize for this because I am convinced that the Christian faith is true. In this postmodern age, in which the idea of God has disappeared from polite society, we must not forget that if Christianity is true, it has profound implications for how we think, how we know, how we discuss, how we seek to persuade others, regardless of whether others believe in God or not. We must argue and think and persuade out of the true worldview, namely the Christian worldview. If Christianity is true, then our knowledge cannot be true knowledge unless it is God-centered, not human-centered. Despite the hatred of religion all around us, we must dare to be Christians. We must witness to the fact that God's purposes are at the center of everything, and that they give everything meaning. To know is to know that. Without knowing that, you can't really know anything. Now, this is an exclusive view of truth. It entails that Christianity is true, and other religions or worldviews are not true. Does this therefore mean that Christians should shut themselves off from the world and reject community and solidarity with non-believers? The answer to that is a resounding no. First, to echo Martin Luther, all human beings are equal before God, individuals of immeasurable dignity made in the image of God, and sinners in need of a savior. Christians and non-Christians all share the human condition. As the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 3, verse 23, I quote, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God," close quote. We are all, believers and non-believers, limited and fallible. We all tend to pursue our own interests first and to resort to dishonest means to get what we want. And despite our flaws, we all possess equal dignity as individuals, as creatures made in God's image. Furthermore, Christians have no reason to think themselves better than others because of their faith. Why? Everything good comes from God's grace and not from human merit. As Paul writes in Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, I quote, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." Close quote. Also, the Christian insight that truth is of God and not of man entails humility and love. The fact that a God who moves in mysterious ways is at the center of that upon which we base our knowledge compels us to acknowledge our profound limitedness. We understand such a small fraction of the reality, the universe that God has created and sustains according to his purposes for it. One cannot know truth without accepting that only God knows and fully understands the whole truth. For the Christian, mystery, not knowing and understanding everything, rests at the very core of human knowledge. And finally, the greatest of these is love. Love of everyone, including one's enemies, is foundational to the gospel. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus Christ grounds our obligations to love even our enemies in the nature of God himself and God's love for all of sinful humanity. I quote from Matthew 5, verses 43 through 48. I quote, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Notice how Jesus brings the idea of perfection together with the idea of loving your enemies. To sum it up, God and God only grounds our individuality. He and he alone is at the center of all true community. It is a profound mystery. Living as individuals in solidarity with others is not primarily about us or about other people. Rather, it is about God. It is about trusting and loving him. It is about glorifying him and him alone. How do we foster individual rights and at the same time solidarity and community with others? And how do we do so in an age in which most people have rejected God? We do so by clinging to the truth and living out that truth as free lords subject to no one and dutiful servants subject to everyone. In humility and love, serving all people, including those who do not accept Christian truth. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Todd. And Hans, the floor is yours now.
Thanks to Elisa for introducing me. And thanks to Todd for preceding me with a beautiful lecture about Christian identity. And unfortunately, I will repeat a lot of what Todd has been telling us already. But I don't think I need to apologize for that, because some things need to be repeated in order to get stuck in our hearts and minds, because they are important. So there might be some repetition, but let's start. The title of my presentation is Self-Identity and its Social Consequences, from Christianity to Postmodernism. The online Oxford Dictionary defines the concept of self-identity as follows. It is the perception or recognition of one's characteristics as a particular individual, especially in relation to social contexts. And my objective is to offer an overview on how the way self-identity is defined in relation to social context and has developed from a traditional Christian one to a so-called postmodern one. Of course, this can only be done in a very sketchy way, without me pretending to be exhaustive or suggesting that the Christian concept has been taken over completely by a postmodern one. Luckily, it's not. The purpose of sessions like this is to make Christians more aware about how their own assumptions or ideas are challenged today, what is at stake, and to see how we could start fighting back by promoting our Christian values more effectively, to the greater glory of God, the defense of human dignity, and the flourishing of our families and societies. What is meant here by a Christian concept of self-identity? First of all, it is the belief we are blessed by being created in the image of our God. Regardless of how much of his creation has been deformed by our sins, not only the original one, but the many sins we commit on a daily basis as well, this does not affect our essence, namely being created with both a potential and with a purpose that is particularly human, as distinguished from the animals, vegetation, etc. From a traditionally Christian point of view, we have the potential of developing into responsible persons, responsible not only towards ourselves, but also to our fellow human beings, creation as a whole, and foremost and finally towards our Creator, God. Responsible means that we are accountable for what we do with the potential God has given us. Of course, potentials differ from one person to another. Some people have more potential than others to become a successful entrepreneur, for being a nurse, to be a civil servant, to be a housewife, or to become leaders in church, civil society, or politics. What counts is the way we have followed up on the responsibilities that come with those potentials. Yet apart from the potentials and the responsibilities that come with them, each and every one of us has a purpose in life. And that purpose is always pointing to something transcendent, whether it be the well-being of our family and fellows at home, the service to my clients or as an employee or entrepreneur, the health of my patients in care homes and hospitals as a nurse or doctor, the well-being of citizens and creation as either an ordinary citizen or civil society or political servant, or ultimately the greater glory of our God. And it is both with respect to potential and purpose to us humans that we see a gradual replacement of this traditional concept of self-identity by a postmodern alternative. What is this postmodern concept of self-identity all about? When it comes to a human potential rather than about responsibilities, this postmodern concept is about freedom to become fully human, according to some inner experience of oneself. Whereas a responsibility refers to a responsibility for somebody else's growth and well-being, the modern concept of freedom reverses the perspective towards the individual itself. It's not the freedom to live a responsible life, but rather the freedom to do what makes me feel good about myself. To be sure, that's a tendency we too easily fall prey to ourselves. Yet, from the beginning, the Christian tradition has called this a sin. It is a sin of narcissism. That is the tendency to turn away from God and instead get excessively focused on one's own self, as well as forms of self-expression that do not show any respect for existing rules of social propriety, political legitimacy, or long-standing religious values like love, dignity, responsibility, and reciprocity. Yet, whereas narcissism used to be called a sin again, in the postmodernism of our days, it tends to be celebrated as something authentic. For instance, you might be created a woman, which naturally means potentially you're able to bear offspring. Today, however, this is called a stereotype, usually considered to be taught by men in order to keep women home, in order to look after the children, while not allowing them to have any opportunity to find their true selves. Having children is only authentic when they are the product of a deliberate choice by women themselves. When falling pregnant is considered a threat to some kind of authentic lifestyle, instead of taking responsibility for the pregnancy, it should be eliminated. And even while being born a woman, when I happen to feel being more of a man or something even more indefinite, what counts is the feeling, not the biological fact. And when this fact is felt to be a threat to one's feeling, it should be eliminated or transformed in a way that makes me feel more authentic and thereby feel good about myself. And since being gay is more authentic than being part of a bourgeois family, his relationship with the partner he chooses for himself should be blessed with at least the same social and political standing as the one that follows up on God's order to procreate and make the earth prosper. Clearly, the Christian God who created each and every one of us with a unique potential in order to find their purpose in life has been eliminated from a postmodern worldview. Instead, individuals start acting as if they are gods themselves, taking any criticism of their concept of self-identity as an offense that should be outlawed under the current anti-discrimination laws that are proceeding and taking prominence over any other kind of law in many Western countries, and unfortunately also the EU. And if EU law is clashing with the laws of the land, EU law will soon be made to prevail. To be sure, these anti-discrimination laws are not meant to protect lives, but to protect so-called autonomous people from being criticized and taken to be different from heterosexuals. To summarize the difference between the Christian and the postmodern concept of self-identity, and by trying to draw the lines as sharply as possible without trying to be offensive, I'm coming to the following points. Whereas Christians consider God to be the Alpha and Omega of the universe, postmodern people see themselves as individuals being the center of the world. Whereas Christians start from the potential laid down by God in creation and derive their purpose in bringing these to fruition to the greater glory of God, postmodern people tend to see creational order as a barrier to become fully human and living an autonomous and authentic human life. Whereas Christians, if they keep taking the prescripts of their own tradition seriously, should care for the unborn, as well as their own neighbors in need, postmodern people prefer to lecture others about the goods that should be done and the sacrifices that should be made to the people far away they have heard about in the media. Whereas Christians, again, if they keep taking the prescripts of their own faith seriously enough, love their environment and take proper care of it since it belongs to God and will be the habitat of their children, postmodern people prefer to talk in terms of more abstract concepts like catastrophic climate change in order to be able to lecture others about the sacrifices that should be made in order to save our planet for the future generations they allow to be killed in the womb. Again, I don't try to be offensive, but just to draw the lines as sharply as possible between the Christian worldview and a postmodern one. Whereas Christians, finally, again, if they keep taking the prescripts of their own faith seriously, should always be open to criticism, postmodern people tend to take criticism personally. And if it offends their feelings, it should be considered to be grounded in a phobia to be criminalized. Hence, talking about homophobia, Islamophobia, etc., etc. Again, I do not try to exaggerate the difference between a Christian concept of self-identity and a postmodern alternative to make us Christians look any better. Too often there is too much of a postmodern in all of us to deserve to be called proper Christians in the first place. Yet it doesn't take away the crucial way in which both concepts of self-identity differ from each other. And since the postmodern concept has been gaining ground during the last half a century, to say the least, it is good to be aware of the far-reaching social and political implication of this tendency. These days, abortion tends to be seen as a human right for women, if not men, to be freely exercised. We see the breakdown of families because of parents feeling the love for each other not being authentic enough any longer. We see gay marriage considered to be on an equal footing with the sacred bonds between faithful heterosexuals. Gender mainstreaming as a way of forcing society to treat people as equals while in fact they are different. We see a tendency towards social disintegration and increasing loneliness since people are claiming their rights to pursue a wholly autonomous, authentic and self-gratifying lifestyle. And finally, we see criminalization of Christian practices and political initiatives that try to counter the same tendencies we just mentioned. With all this in mind, I think it's time for all of us to stand up and speak out loud. It's time to fight for what's right. It's time to put our potentials to favor the well-being of our fellow humans and creational order, and to find our purpose in glorifying our God, rather than having the culture of narcissism prevail and destroy what's left of our Christian civilization. Thank you very much.
To you also, Hans. And now, Daniel, you can continue with your talk.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you to one of us for the invitation, for Leontien for asking me, Elisa, for introducing me, and also Todd and Hans for your wonderful talks just now. I'm a scientist, so I cannot live without PowerPoint. This is the reason why I've prepared some slides, which I'll share with you now. So Leontien asked me to relate to the theme of today, but also to think about the future of Europe, given the EU discussion on this theme. Well, I'm afraid I'm not a politician. I'm a theoretical biologist. I have an active interest in great ideas. And well, I'm going to come at this very similar ideas as the previous speakers, but from a maybe a bit more philosophical angle. So in this sense, I agree with Professor Bas Kooijman of the VU University, under who I studied, who used to say that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. So it's gonna be a bit theoretical, but I think in the end very practical. And I think this is especially true at a time of large social changes and polarization, like the time in which we're living. We really have to go back to our starting points to see whether we're taking the right direction. Now, in this talk, I'll give an overview of an argument that I hope to elaborate further in a booklet called Hope for an Information Age, which is a booklet which builds forward on Freedom in Quarantine, which was published last year. And yeah, if you're interested in these arguments, you can find a bit more in my author website, danielbernardus.com. Which, by the way, are my first names because they're internationally maybe a little bit more accessible than Daan van Schalkwijk. All right, so where from and where to? Europe has had a large and rich history, the value of which, however, is currently not universally recognized. Well, to be quite honest, Europe has for a long time had a difficult relationship with its own past. How else can we explain that a period, for example, like the Carolingian Renaissance, can be classified in the popular mind as part of the Dark Ages? I'll now mention a name that was mentioned a few times before, because according to Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, medieval times were intense times with more extreme living conditions than nowadays, but also with an intensely lived pathos. It was a time in which people highly valued their social status, and for better and for worse. For better, because it clarified relationships and it gave a certain clarity and stability in these relationships. For worse, because especially by our standards, there was not a lot of social mobility. The freedom to find a place in society was rather limited. Now, modernity in reaction has both in thought and practice valued freedom and equality. The freedom to do what we want to do and to be what we want to be, and equally so that people be not judged only according to their social status. While modernity has brought us very far along the path of these ideals, and we are reaping their benefits, we're now also at a time when the drawbacks of the modern worldview come in even sharper focus. Professor Andreas Kinneging, to cite another Dutch thinker, has called attention to the fact that often extreme interpretations of freedom and equality, as they exist nowadays, do not actually combine well. In addition, looking around us, we see a widespread sense of unease among young people, many of whom grew up in broken families, are struggling with mental health problems, and they find it hard to give a meaning to what they do and to their contribution to society. Now, interestingly, and without suggesting that in the past everything was better, at least several of our current problems were much less prevalent in medieval society. Now, one important problem of our times is a problem of direction. Postmodern thought is wary of great stories. Well, that's not just them. For example, also political philosopher Erik Voegelin warned a few decades ago. He said with this is a kind of a slogan based on his thought, don't immanentize the eschaton. Don't try to bring heaven to earth through your theories. Recently, Bishop Robert Barron in a podcast warned that Western society has wanted to found itself upon ideals, but practice has meanwhile shown us that this doesn't lead to the utopia that is promised. Should we then look for new ideals at all? And what direction should we take? I think this is a problem that a lot of our contemporaries are struggling with. Finally, as historian John Lukács argues in his book At the End of an Age, big shifts in our view on the world and on society tend to not be just shift in ideas, but also in sociological situations. The modern shift towards the ideal of freedom and equality, for example, were accompanied by ever-increasing urbanization. In the urban setting, freedom and equality can thrive. As our ongoing pandemic is helping us to realize more strongly, we're in the middle of a shift towards an information age. The progress of information technology is having large consequences for the way we live together and interact with each other, now via webinar. It is reshaping the view we view the world and what we do and do not find morally acceptable. On the one hand, information technology has kept large part of society functioning during this pandemic. On the other hand, it's helping to implement, for example, an unparalleled totalitarianism through face recognition on the street in some countries. Now, what direction is that pushing us in for our ideas and our practice? So let's face reality. Both the problem of direction in our information and our information age relate to the way we approach and deal with knowledge. So, for example, on the one hand, our society, including policymakers, value empirical evidence a lot. For example, there always have to be statistics or proposals are not taken seriously. The scientific method has helped us progress a lot. So therefore, people find it hard to trust in anything else. On the other hand, in the realm of opinion, of those statements whose validity cannot be empirically verified, it's kind of the law of the jungle. The law of the jungle seems to hold, the survival of the fittest. The idea that most people hold is the best one. After all, there's no reality check for such opinion statements. Well, or is there? information technology is on the scientific side of this debate, whereas the question of direction that I talked about earlier is on the opinion side of the debate, and therefore it seemed to be unsolvable. Now, the interesting thing is that these two sides do meet in practice because the jungle of opinions is actually facilitated by information technology. Now, as I recently explained in Freedom in Quarantine, which is a booklet written with and largely inspired by a Spanish philosopher called Leonardo Polo, who's in the kind of the realist, Aristotelian, Thomistic tradition, it's good to realize, even though he goes further, it's good to realize this modern insistence on empirical knowledge or science has been developed in reaction to classical philosophical thought, especially the tradition that stems from ancient Greece, in which human beings were seen to be capable of living up to some timeless ideals, which were not measurable, but still always good for them. Living a life according to reason would be one such Greek ideal. Modern thinkers thought that such ideals were somehow suffocating, as they saw medieval society to be suffocating, and wanted to make room for practical innovation by tuning down the search for timeless human truths. For they correctly identified that in classical thought, such practical progress was not very highly valued. So the classical insights kind of went out of the window, relegated to the realm of opinion, to make use for empirical knowledge that would be useful for progress in the practical world. Now, in Freedom in Quarantine, Polo proposes a new synthesis, which both values the modern insistence on practical progress, which has brought us a lot of good, as well as the classical search for timeless truth, and makes the two compatible through his theory of knowledge and through the notion of the person, which is a classical Christian one. Now, starting with theory of knowledge, Polo takes up and develops a classical discussion about the mental limit, which means that our concepts really refer to reality, but only do so in a limited way, which is what the first speaker talked about when he said, well, we as human beings don't know, God knows the fullness, but we only know limited things. That is important because it helps us realize that classical truths can be at the same time helpful, but also not suffocating, because they point us in the right direction, but there's always more for us to know and explore, especially in God. God is endless, we can always explore more, but also in the world around us. Secondly, the notion of person. Polo takes his cue here, not so much from Boethius, as is usually done, but rather from the Cappadocian fathers like St. Gregory of Nyssa. These show us that according to Christianity, well, we know that they've reflected a lot about that there's one God in three persons. The notion of person in God then refers especially to intimate relationality. The Father relates to the Son to the Father, and the Father and Son relate to the Holy Spirit. Being a created person points to the fact that human beings are most fundamentally children, and therefore are intimately related to our human parents as well to our Heavenly Father. Personhood, says Polo, refers primarily to our being more, in Spanish, ser además. Createdness also explains the newness that each person is, and the source of creativity that each of us is capable of. Realizing that we are persons means that we are more than the limits of any theoretical insight. Creativity can always build forward on and add to what we have received, also in the practical and empirical realm. In this way, the best of classical and modern thought come together. So Polo's theory of knowledge and the notion of personhood are intimately related. The person is not just another idealism. Going beyond the mental limit is also methodologically a way to arrive at the person. We recognize our personhood by opening ourselves up to reality, a reality that goes beyond the empirically measurable. Now, postmodern thought is good at criticizing modern thought and modern society, and often does so with reason. We live in a complex time in which all sorts of hidden inequalities between people exist, which can give a sense of injustice. The complexity of our world makes it hard for people to find a sense of identity and belonging. And the digital world is only making it more difficult to find a sense of direction, not less. Unfortunately, while postmodernity criticizes, the way forward of autonomy and radical freedom it offers does not seem to provide a satisfactory solution to the problem it raises. And I agree with the previous speaker that it's rather narcissistic. Making people aware of structural problems is not a structural solution, especially if the awareness it raises of the things that are wrong is itself quite partial and ad hoc. If we have learned anything from modernity, then it's probably that we should value ideals like freedom and equality, but not idolize them. They've brought us far, and we shouldn't be ungrateful either. But it's hard to see how any human ideal can help us, for example, face the lack of meaning that young people wrestle with. So are there alternative approaches? Recognizing the reality of our personhood helps us to value both technological progress as well as timeless classical truths about ourselves, and put these at the service of our interpersonal relationships. In the first instance of that, the relationship with God, but also the relationship with other people. But perhaps even more importantly, it points us towards a way forward that is at once personal and communal. It asks us to open up to reality and answer an intimate call from the Father, with a capital letter, who sustains us. Answering this call is an enterprise of hope. The call is intimate, but invites us to go on a mission that transcends us, that calls us to personal growth, and puts it at the service of society. It is therefore not a human idealism, but rather taps into the transcendent source of creative innovation, of continuous supportive strength. Therefore, this mission is hopeful and exciting. What personal missions can people really expect to receive? On the one hand, surprise is the only constant when it comes to the content of the mission, because God is infinitely creative and can give us whatever mission he wants to. But it can be expected that these personal missions, for them to be received and to take root, a first step is certainly the strengthening of the family as a source of renewed missionary education and also hopeful innovation. Other related themes may include the strengthening of social fraternity, the respect for life, but also the care for those whose life is put in a difficult situation. It may also include the re-elaboration of the social game, not as a competition, but rather as a game where winning lies in participating. But again, if it comes to the content of personal missions, really surprise is the only constant. And setting out to complete one's mission is an exercise of hope, and it's very exciting. So as promised at the start, this has only been an outline of an argument that I hope to develop further in Hope for an Information Age, that is building forward on the already published Freedom in Quarantine. I hope this has been interesting to you, especially maybe for the more philosophically minded. So at danielbernards.com you can find a bit more about this. So I'm very grateful for the invitation and also for your attention. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, and all the speakers for your inspiring talks. And there were 3 points of view which struck me. Todd, what resonates in my mind is that you said clinging to the truth. Really, that says something. And from Hans, I noticed, to be sure, these anti-discrimination EU laws are not meant to protect lives. That's really the sad reality. And Daniel was also reflecting to the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, and really he might be a relative of Todd. It's very fascinating. So I didn't notice that many questions in the chat, but we do have, of course, lots of questions. And I have a question here, and it is for all the 3 speakers. And it's about that we know that our Christian values as an image of God, our identity is rooted not in ourselves, but in our Creator, and that we are not autonomous beings. But how can we dialogue and explain this great value to the human being, to people who do not believe in the existence of God, and not only do not believe in God, but they do not believe in objective truth? So how can we communicate to people who don't believe? Todd, maybe you can start from this.
Thank you. I'm very technologically challenged, thus it takes me way too long to unmute, so sorry about that. Thank you, Leontine, for your question. I really appreciate it. And thank you also for inviting me, Leontine, and for organizing the whole thing over the course of several months. I also want to thank Hans and Daniel for their presentations, which were excellent presentations. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So yeah, your question, Leontine, goes to the heart of the matter, really. And it actually goes to the question of missions, right? It goes to the question of evangelization. How do you spread the good news in the world if you are a Christian? So I guess I would say that one, it of course depends on each individual situation. But two, I would say that first of all, I think it's very important to ask people in keeping with their dignity as individuals, with the fact that we approach people in humility with the knowledge of our own limitedness, and we approach people in love, desiring to love others as God loves us, that we first listen to people. We ask them what they believe, and we listen without the idea of how do we argue, how we're going to argue against this. No, just listen and ask questions, not with the desire to trip people up or confuse people with your questions or show how you're right and they didn't think of something, but rather ask questions so that you're sure you understand what people believe, what the individual, let's say, that you're talking with believes and what he or she doesn't believe. So I think first is listening. Second is questioning. And third is then honestly saying, this is what I believe. Not expecting them immediately to share your beliefs, but simply explaining in respect, humility, and love what you believe as a Christian, let's say, and why, and how you believe that that fits with the evidence that we're given in life, and how you believe that that fits with the idea of human flourishing and helps to promote human flourishing. So in the end, I guess I would say, sum it up with the Apostle Paul's exhortation to us as Christians: always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. Always be ready to speak of your faith and explain it to others.
Hans, do you have ideas about this?
I totally agree with Todd that listening is very important, because there has been a generation that that wasn't particularly inspired by the way Christians were living their lives. So there is no reason for any arrogance towards people that do not believe, let's say, the way we believe. From my own point of view, I told you before, Leontine, Todd was there as well. I'm a born-again Christian. I grew up in a Dutch Reformed community, very strict Reformed Dutch community, and not to say anything negative about my parents, but I just didn't understand what they were believing, even though they were decent people. But both their way of talking as their way of living just looked repulsive to me, to be honest. That doesn't say anything of the way they were living. First of all, it was my own pride as a human being. I was a postmodern individual, to say. So when I'm criticizing postmodernism, it's partly criticizing my own old self, the way I used to be. And I agree with Todd when he says it's listening and it's humility that might convince other peoples, not only in the way we talk, but also the way we live our lives. And it might look repulsive to people that are self-obsessed and think living out their lives in ultimate freedom is leading to ultimate happiness. But I can tell you from my own experience, it's not. So let's not be, let's not lose faith, let's say. And I think there is a generation growing up at the moment that's not so much anti-Christian, and I'm talking about the younger generation, but more open to what Christianity is all about. The generation of the 60s seems to be ruling the world, but the younger generation is really more open to what Christianity is all about. And as long as we are keep listening, knowing those people don't know anything about Christianity from the way they were brought up, or have been growing as in a Christian community, but didn't feel inspired at that moment to follow their parents the way they were living the Christian communities. But I think we are on our way back. And in the Netherlands, at least, I can speak for the Netherlands, when it comes to abortion, for instance, a younger generation starts asking themselves questions. What is so self-evident about pro-choice? When they realize it's all about children dying in the womb. And that tendency to go for freedom at the expense of responsibilities and in the end, human lives, younger generations are not taking that at face value. They are more open to our way of looking at the world. That doesn't mean they will start believing in God right away, but hopefully they are inspired by our way of life. And at least are triggered to ask us questions and to looking for an alternative to their own empty, self-obsessed lifestyle. And again, I'm talking from my own experience. So again, when I'm criticizing postmodern mentality, postmodern ideology, it's just fighting my own self.
Now, that's good to hear. There's maybe some hope for the future. Dan, how can you comment on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I second the comments made by the previous speakers, especially about the value of listening. I think it's very important. I would like to add a few notes. So first of all, I think that it's important that everybody, also in evangelizing and talking about these issues, kind of talk to God himself and see, what is my talent and what can I contribute. I think that at least I feel a strong calling to think about things philosophically. And I'm noticing, so I teach at Amsterdam University College, which is I can say, very postmodern place, in the sense that there's a lot of people that have a lot of postmodern ideologies there. And if I start talking about, my belief in God and how we have to give him glory in his life, which is completely true, but they disconnect. I cannot have a conversation with them about this. However, if I talk to them about what it means to be a person, and I say, well, this is based on the Christian tradition, but you don't have to be a Christian to think about these things, and let's explore what this can mean and how this can be important to you. They do open up, so they think, well, I think it's interesting, and we talk about, the intimate relationships that they have to other people, what that means, and how that actually goes beyond the kind of scientific mentality they're in. I teach a lot of science students that kind of get indoctrinated with, everything is science, or all the rest is only subjective. I say, well, sorry, but there are some things that you call subjective, like the desire to be loved, which are completely universal, right? So subjective is not so subjective. So at least for me, that is a way to enter the dialogue, to ask them questions about some very obvious things. So recently in class, we had a month to talk about to basically talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. So I said, what do you want to talk about? They wanted to talk about ethics. I was very surprised, because I thought, oh, they're all relativists, but no, they wanted to talk about ethics. So we talked about very fundamental things, like what does the good and the bad mean, right? Give me some examples from your own experience. And I can tell you all that nearly everything these people told me, these very postmodern kids told me about their ethics, I agreed with. So if you go to the very fundamentals, people are not so bad. They can be misleaded, they can be And of course, they also, I mean, they're also, yeah, I mean, they also have their bad things. I also have my bad things. But there, what I want to say, there's also a spark of goodness in them, and I think it's good that we look for that and that we dialogue with that, and then little by little, well, with God's grace, we can help them towards the faith, which is a grace I cannot give them, but I can pray for. So I have to pray for them and I have to help them, and then through the dialogue again, each one using the talents that God has given him or her to see how we can help people along. So this is my little 2 cents.
Daniel, Remy, what do you think? Can you add something on this?
I'm afraid not that great a deal. On the other hand, I was edified, sort of, sorry for the word, which is at present time rather obsolete and sounds even ridiculous, but I really was edified by what people told me or told us, each and every people who is listening now. Well, the problem, you know, is that there are so few people who really listen to each other. And well, this was pointed out by Daniel just a while ago. There are topics which can hardly be broached in public. And if you simply allude to them, well, people, well, shut like oysters this way. And you can't enter, well, the innermost core of what they think, what they really think. And well, we have to develop some strategies for us to be able to enter the holy precincts, you know, to really be listened to. This is not that easy. As far as I'm concerned, you know, one of the best tools, one of the best ploys I can bring to bear is humor. If people begin to laugh or even to smile, well, that's a beginning. That's an opening. Well, that's my own way, but other people may have other, well, practices, other means for them to enter into a real contact with people. But we live in a society at present in which people talk, well, don't really talk to each other, don't really listen to each other, but talk to and listen to only people who already share their opinions. And by the way, the progress in the social means of communication, the progress of the media, allows us to listen only to the programs that are made by people who think the way we do think already. We can read newspapers or periodicals of all kinds, which well, confirm us in our ideas and which do not really bring us in contact with other opinions, other worldviews. That's a big problem. I just wanted to ask it. I have no ready-made solution.
So it's about social media, and the social media only give opinions. How do you think we can help people to discover the truth?
Well, it's not true that social media only give opinions, because there may be truth as well. But it's hard to distinguish, of course. That's the problem. So you know, it seems to me that what we need to foment somehow again is a culture of encounter with reality. Help people face the reality of their own lives and think about things that a lot of times people think are obvious. I've recently read some books by a American scholar, John Senior. I don't know whether Todd knows him, but anyway, he was a university teacher also, and he helped the students a lot by just taking them outside and watching the stars. And now that's not exactly social media, but it is, helping people to, on the one hand, face the reality of their lives, of the world around them, so that they can kind of relate to social media in a healthy way. So I think that the solution with social media, of a healthy relationship with social media, doesn't lie in social media. It lies in the life of people. Teaching people how to deal with it, how to kind of put it into a framework, knowing when to turn off your internet and your Wi-Fi sometimes, but then turn it on at times when you can kind of meaningfully engage with it. Also teaching people how to be authentic in social media. For instance, what kind of image do you project to social media? Are you only projecting yourself and your me and what I am all about? Or is it more about trying to help other people? So for instance, do you share a nice article that you've read or something that is interesting for other people, rather thinking about others than thinking about yourself? So I think we have to understand, and I think this is a project, to kind of think through how we can also live virtues, which in the end are some things that are in reality, and that we can get to know through reality, if we think about it. But how can we live virtues in the social media area also? Because it is in the end a sort of kind of place we live, sort of extension of a place we live. So it's there we can also try to live these virtues. But again, we only get there when we first take a step back, face reality, get to know ourselves better, know what we want, and then meaningfully engage with social media in that way.
Then I think we are running out of time. So Remy, Professor Braak, will you please make the concluding remarks?
Thank you so much for the invitation. That's a great honor which is bestowed upon me. Well, I was charged with the honorable task of saying some words of conclusion. We have been listening to 3 scholars and scientists who articulated a careful and well-grounded plea on behalf of the person. They did that each from the vantage point of their field of competence, and each in his own style, but all on the basis of their Christian faith. Well, let me first sum up the results. Human beings are persons and not only individuals. Each and every human being is a person. An animal is an individual sample of its species. What the animal does is what its instinct tells it to do. Those features are clearly to be seen in wild animals. To be sure, tame animals and pet animals can have a smattering of personality, but they get it from their sharing the life of the humans, who sort of draw them into the sphere of personal existence. A person is a being which will evolve into a member of a family, a speaker of a language, a citizen or subject of a polity. This will happen if and only if the necessary conditions are there. The first one consisting in being left alive and properly looked after, preferably by the natural parents, most preferably by parents belonging to the 2 different sexes. If this is the case, the basic family, the so-called nuclear family, is on a smaller scale a sample of the whole humankind, which consists of male and female people. Same-sex couples may or may not, who can know and judge, harbor genuine love. But in any case, they mirror only 1/2 of what being human is all about. Furthermore, a person is a being which has a history, which he or she recollects in his or her memory as a personal story. This history is shaped by a long chain of choices, and of choices made in freedom. Finally, each person has a destiny. Each person can shape him or herself on the basis of what he or she received from the forebears, the body, the mores, the social status, etc., and taking into account what happened from external factors during his or her course. Christians even believe that our destiny leads to what we shall be in eternity. Let me now repeat and add an important qualification. A person is a being which will evolve into a member of a definite family, a speaker of a definite language, a citizen or subject of a definite polity. Thus, the individual identity of the person is strongly linked up with collective identity and cultural identity. Collective identity because we are in relation with other human beings who are our contemporaries. My identity is in itself a link with my parents, my siblings, spouse and children, if any, with my fellow speakers, with my partners in the exchange of goods and services in economy, with my fellow citizens, with the members of the same religious community, and so on and so forth. Cultural identity is larger in scope. It is larger in time and larger in space. It is larger in space, for persons share the same cultural references with the denizens of their province, of their country, and even with whomever lives in the same large area of civilization. More important, cultural identity is larger in time, for a person doesn't speak an idiom that he or she invented, but a language he or she found ready-made and received from the immediate surrounding, to which this language had itself been transmitted by former generations. The same holds good for bodily language, the gait, the gestures of our arms and so on, or of my hands right now. It holds good too for our taste, for what we consider beautiful, for the masterpieces of literature and art. We are not nailed to our cultural identity. On the contrary, we can travel, we can learn foreign languages, we can get accustomed to foreign food, learn to appreciate other forms of music, and so on. But even in our own culture, we can, and even up to a point we should, develop our own way of dealing with the tradition which was handed over to us. For instance, we can produce, for the most part in our mother tongue, works of literature which will bear the stamp of a totally personal style. But the very way in which we speak and the content of what we say are already expressions of our personal being, of our own style. This happens for every person on the globe. Yet this is not self-evident. The very idea of a person, the very idea that each and every human being is a person, is Christian in origin. And one may ask, if it is not doomed to wither away from our consciousness, if the Christian influence on our mores keeps ebbing. The person has in the present world two powerful enemies. I mean the state and the market. I certainly don't mean thereby the persons who wield power in the political communities or pull the strings in the economy. I mean two systems, two logics. Both would reduce human beings to isolated individuals, severed from whatever they belong to, their origins, their family, their moral principles. Such a social atom would be hardly more than a producer and consumer, taxpayer, in some cases cannon fodder, at the beck and call of state and market. Hence our present task, our present commitment on behalf of the person. The question of the legal scholar to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Who is the neighbor whom I am commanded to love as myself? This question was far from being ociose. The issue was hotly debated, and Jesus's radical answer met contradiction. Saint Paul, very much in the wake of Jesus, drew the conclusion and drove the nail home. He saw the differences in sex, male or female, in social status, slave or master, in religion, Greek or Jew, as utterly real, but he declared them irrelevant in the last resort. Let me point out a paradox of sorts. Being a person is not the privilege of Christians. Far from that. It is even a basic tenet of Christianity that human beings all have the same share in humanity, for two reasons. First, because they share the same nature. Natural properties of beings may be difficult to assess. Nature likes to hide, said already Heraclitus. They nevertheless possess an objective reality. Yet, it looks like that in the present time, this nature is slowly sweeping out of the ken of human beings themselves. Christians don't believe only that there is something above nature. They are not simply Yetists. And here we have to thank Dutch people for this beautiful new world. Christians believe that this something is in fact a somebody who loves each of us and wants him or her to be and to flourish. This is the second reason. Human beings share the same humanity because they take part in the same history, a salvation history of creation, fall, and redemption. Now, and here the paradox comes to a head. Far from neglecting nature, Christians respect and defend it. They even are among the last ones who defend it. One knows the scholastic adage, grace doesn't do away with nature, but makes it more perfect. Gratia non tollit naturam, sed perficit et. And now it might even be the case that grace doesn't content itself with leaving nature alone as an infrastructure on which grace will build a superstructure. In the present time, grace and this is our task, must first defend nature against her enemies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Remy. Very interesting talk. So then it rests only for me to thank all the speakers. I think it's also recorded. You can look it back on Facebook. You can share it on Facebook probably. And I also would like to make you aware of our next webinar. It's the 15th of July, organized by Malta, about the embryo. Okay, thank you very much.